He was a 30-year-old billionaire, a man who had always kept his heart guarded. Love had no place in his world, and relationships were a luxury he couldn't afford. His empire demanded too much of him. In a bid to protect everything he had built, he married a woman he barely knew. For 2 years, they existed side by side in a mansion filled with silence, living like strangers, each choosing to remain distant. But then, one night, everything changed. A single, unexpected moment of intimacy, a fleeting connection that neither of them could erase from their minds, no matter how hard they tried. Now, they're falling for each other, slowly, reluctantly, and dangerously. Pretending it means nothing is no longer an option. If you enjoy this story, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It means the world to us. Don't forget to turn on post notifications so you never miss a story. Thank you, and now sit back and relax as we journey into this captivating tale. The boardroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. A group of eager executives sat across from Nathaniel, the CEO of Nathaniel Industries, hoping to convince him to invest in their groundbreaking idea. The team was confident, pitching their proposal with all the excitement of a startup on the brink of something revolutionary. But Bramston wasn't fazed. He sat back in his chair, observing them with a calculating gaze that missed nothing. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, tapping in time with the seconds that ticked by. As they spoke, his mind ran calculations, scrutinizing every word, every gesture, looking for cracks in the carefully constructed narrative. Bramston, they called him, his nickname among those who worked with him. It was earned, a reflection of his unyielding nature and his ability to see through deceit. Where others might have been swayed by enthusiasm or charm, Bramston remained unmoved. His eyes narrowed, calculating the value of their proposal against the reality of his empire. A multi-million-dollar venture. He'd seen countless ideas come and go, each more desperate than the last. This one was no different. He couldn't throw $7 million at something that lacked substance, something that didn't show the kind of rigor or vision that had built his empire. His decision was swift, final. "No," he said, his voice cold, without hesitation. The room fell silent. No one dared to speak. He had made his judgment. With a deliberate calmness, Bramston stood up from the table, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His expression remained unchanged, unyielding, as he turned toward the door. His assistant, Thomas, followed him without a word, the only sound the soft thud of his footsteps echoing through the hall. Thomas, his best friend since childhood, was the only person who truly understood Bramston. There were whispers about their relationship, some speculating that the two were more than friends, but those who truly knew them understood the depth of their bond. Bramston didn't care for women. He'd never had a romantic relationship, never felt the desire, never saw the point. Women were distractions in a world that demanded focus. He had no interest in intimacy, no need for love. He'd witnessed the rise and fall of men, ambitious men, driven men, who had lost themselves to the whims of their emotions. He had learned the hard way that love made people vulnerable, and vulnerability was a weakness he couldn't afford. Bramston's focus was always clear: build, dominate, conquer. Empires didn't build themselves, and he wasn't about to waste time chasing after something as fleeting as love. Nathaniel stood firm before his father, Nathaniel Richard, the retired general and owner of Nathaniel Industries, a company built from the ground up, yet now under siege from a wave of powerful venture capitalists. The business was slipping, no matter how tightly Bramston gripped the reins. He had spent years in the shadows of his father's expectations, trying to prove himself worthy of the empire his father had chosen not to manage, handing it to him instead. But now, as the company faced a crisis unlike any before, Bramston's resolve began to waver. He had always carried the weight of his father's doubt, but in this moment, He was determined to prove he could handle the pressure. He told his father he would take care of it, that he had everything under control. His father, sitting by the pool with the steady gaze of a man who had seen it all, didn't flinch as he locked eyes with him. "You are not fit," he said bluntly, his words cutting deeper than any failure could. Their rivalry had always been hidden from the public eye, the unspoken tension between father and son a constant undercurrent. To the world, Nathaniel Richard was the perfect patriarch, but to Bramston, he was the unyielding figure who had always doubted his ability. As Nathaniel Industries teetered on the brink of collapse, his father proposed a solution, a marriage not out of love, but out of necessity. He suggested that Bramston marry the daughter of one of his old friends, a powerful business mogul in her own right. She was brilliant, driven, and everything Bramston wasn't, at least in his father's eyes. The engagement was announced swiftly, with no fanfare, no affection, just a cold, contractual agreement meant to merge not only their companies, but their bloodlines. The union would be the foundation for saving the empire, securing its future in the hands of a woman who could help hold it all together. Bramston's world turned upside down as he walked down a path he never envisioned for himself. His heart was not part of this equation, and neither was love. The marriage was pure business, a strategy to salvage what his father and their families had spent decades building. Rachel and Bramston's wedding was a quiet affair, private, calculated, and attended only by a select circle of dignitaries and business associates. There were no grand declarations, no speeches of love, just a ceremonial exchange of obligations. Rachel had agreed to the marriage for one reason only: her father, his peace, his pride. Those mattered more to her than her own dreams. She had grown up surrounded by influence and affluence, walked hallways lined with power and legacy, and learned early that emotions had no place in negotiations. The ceremony passed like a formal handshake, and not once did they meet each other's eyes. To anyone watching, they looked like two strangers in the middle of a carefully orchestrated pact. Rachel wore elegance like armor and carried herself with quiet dignity, but even behind her composed gaze, she knew. This wasn't about love. It was a transaction, and she had accepted the terms. After the final round of congratulations, Bramston turned to his staff and, without ceremony, instructed them to take Rachel to her quarters. He didn't offer a tour, a word of welcome, or even a glance that suggested acknowledgement. As they walked through the grand halls of Nathaniel, she trailed the staff silently, her footsteps echoing off marble floors polished to perfection. When they opened the door to the room prepared for her, she stepped in without pause. No questions, no hesitation. She didn't care for chandeliers or silk bedding. She had seen all of it before. She existed in her own world, one where expectations didn't surprise her anymore. And as the door closed behind her, Rachel understood her new reality clearly. She had entered a marriage where they would walk the same halls but remain worlds apart. Still, in the quiet corners of her mind, she remembered her promise to try, not for herself, but for the man who raised her. Weeks turned into months, and Rachel and Bramston continued to drift like strangers, sharing space, but not a life. They moved through the grand halls of the estate as if on parallel tracks, never clashing, never connecting. Meals were taken at different times, often in different wings of the house. When they passed each other, their greetings were cold nods, distant and detached, like two executives exchanging polite acknowledgement rather than husband and wife. They never argued. There was no passion even for that. Just silence and avoidance, as though being near each other was a quiet inconvenience neither wanted to address. And yet, there were moments, fleeting but real, when Rachel felt the urge to speak, to break the monotony of their arrangement. For all the wealth, power, and prestige that surrounded them, she believed life had to offer something deeper. But each time she considered opening a conversation, she was met with a wall. Bramston was shutting every door, emotionally and physically. His actions were deliberate, retreating from any possibility of connection. He wasn't rude, just unreachable. Rachel soon realized it wasn't about her. It was something deeper, embedded within him. He didn't just avoid conversation, he feared it, as though words might unravel a carefully controlled world he wasn't ready to face. Inside the walls of their home, they lived as distant acquaintances, two lives under one roof, carefully choreographed to never collide. But in public, they wore the mask of unity, exchanging smiles and subtle gestures that gave the illusion of closeness. For the outside world, they were the perfect couple, graceful, composed, untouchable. On the morning of their second wedding anniversary, Rachel rose like any other day, checked her calendar, and quietly noted the date. She didn't expect flowers, nor a message. There had never been a celebration before. With no plans from him, she began getting ready to meet a few friends, her routine as precise as ever. Then came a gentle knock. Peter, one of the household staff, stepped in with a measured tone. "From your husband," he said, placing several elegantly wrapped boxes on the table. Her eyes lingered on them in disbelief. Gifts? She moved slowly, unwrapping them one by one, designer items, curated with surprising care. But what stole her breath was the final box, a diamond-studded necklace, delicate and gleaming, with a single, intricately carved letter R. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope tucked beneath it, an invitation to a Grey-Tech Gala, signed in his clean, unmistakable handwriting. That evening, she descended the staircase dressed in a fitted gown of deep wine silk, her hair swept up with quiet elegance. In the foyer, Bramston stood waiting in a tailored black tuxedo, refined and still, like the man she had always known, yet somehow different. His eyes met hers, lingering just a moment too long before he said, "You look beautiful." It was measured, maybe even practiced, but it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Thank you. And for the gifts," she said gently, watching him with curiosity. A faint shift passed between them, unspoken yet undeniable. They rode to the gala in silence, but not the usual kind. It felt charged, like something unspoken had finally stirred. At the gala, they moved through the crowd with ease, smiling, shaking hands, posing for cameras. But between the handshakes and pleasantries, Rachel noticed something new, his stolen glances, the way his gaze softened when it lingered on her. Something was changing, quietly unfolding in the spaces where silence used to live. Neither of them expected it. Neither of them was ready, but it was happening. The gala had ended in a downpour, rain falling in thick sheets as they hurried to the car, soaked just enough for the chill to cling to their skin. Neither spoke during the drive, the silence more thoughtful than tense. When they arrived home, they retreated to their separate rooms like always, but as Rachel stepped into her doorway, she heard something that made her pause. His voice, soft, almost uncertain. "Good night, Rachel." It caught her off guard. He had never said that before. Maybe it was a slip, a formality, but it lingered in her mind like a whisper she couldn't forget. Now, hours later, dressed in a simple nightgown, she lay on her bed, sleep elusive. She wasn't sure what kept her awake, hunger, restlessness, or the echo of his voice, but the silence in the house felt heavier tonight, like the rain tapping softly against the windows was stirring something unspoken. She rose, barefoot, and made her way to the kitchen, not wanting to wake Peter. As she stepped into the main hallway, she bumped into Bramston. He looked startled but calm, his voice low. "You're awake," he said. "So are you," she replied, glancing away. "Couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," he murmured, turning back briefly as if he'd forgotten something. She continued into the kitchen, poured cereal into a bowl, and sat at the counter in the dim light. When she looked up again, he was there, standing at the doorway in a white singlet and black shorts, the soft light catching on his damp hair. He looked different, not in the way of clothing, but something in his face, less guarded, more real. He smiled faintly and stepped closer. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his tone steady, no longer the voice of the untouchable CEO, but of a man slowly lowering his guard. "Thinking about me?" she asked, raising a spoon to her lips, trying to steady the tremor in her hand. "Yes," he confessed, his voice rough and quiet. "More than I probably should." She drew in a shaky breath, her heart pounding with a rhythm she hadn't felt in a long time. "You're my husband," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're allowed to think about me." His gaze held hers, steady but uncertain. But, without fully realizing it, her hands reached up and rested gently against his chest. Beneath her palms, she felt the calm, steady thud of his heartbeat, a silent truth that neither of them had acknowledged before. Something shifted within her, a barrier worn thin by years of distance beginning to fall. "Then stop holding back," she breathed, her eyes locked on his, "and just feel." It began in the quiet glow of the kitchen, the soft patter of rain still tapping against the windows. Rachel sat on the edge of the marble counter, barefoot and lost in thought, her silk robe gently clinging to her form. Bramston stepped closer, not with urgency, but with something slower, heavier, something he couldn't name. His hands found her waist, warm and careful, lifting her gently onto the table as if asking permission without words. She didn't resist. Her arms slid around his neck, fingers brushing through his hair, and he breathed in the scent of her skin, soft, clean, and familiar in a way that caught him off guard. He kissed her lips slowly, reverently, then moved lower, tracing along her jaw before pressing a lingering kiss against the curve of her lower lip, savoring her. She tilted her head back slightly, a quiet breath escaping her, and something between them shifted, something deeper than desire. He carried her through the dim hallway, moving from the couch where it began to the bedroom that had never truly felt shared, until now. Each step was deliberate, each movement unhurried, like he wanted to remember it all. Clothes slipped away, forgotten, not torn or tossed, but released like burdens. Their bodies came together not in rush, but in rhythm, slow and honest. Skin learning skin. The moans that passed between them were not loud or frantic, but soft and raw, shaped by vulnerability. When he moved inside her, it wasn't power or control. It was surrender, the kind that only comes from breaking years of silence. His mouth returned to hers again and again, as if afraid she'd vanish, as if this moment was the only real thing he'd ever known. When it was over, they didn't part. Their limbs remained tangled, breaths still sinking slowly in the silence. She turned to him, wanting to say something, anything, but before her words could form, he pulled her close again and kissed her deeply, as if he wasn't ready to let her voice interrupt what they had just created. But morning came too soon. The golden light spilled across the room, soft and unassuming, casting warmth where there now lived confusion. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, his back turned to her. His posture was stiff, his fingers twitching slightly, as if his body was holding onto a battle he hadn't won. He didn't speak, didn't glance her way. It was as though the man who had whispered her name in the dark, who had trembled against her body and worshipped every part of her, no longer existed. She remained still, heart aching with questions she couldn't voice. That night had meant something. She had felt it in every touch, every kiss, in the way he had held her like she was something precious, fragile, real. And now he sat there, silent, as though none of it happened, as though she hadn't just held the version of him the world never saw. It wasn't rejection that cut. It was absence, not of his body, but of the connection they had finally let themselves feel. She had cherished every second of it. But now, he wouldn't even look at her. He stood by the edge of the bed, already half-dressed, slipping on his shirt with practiced precision, each button fastened like he was trying to rebuild the walls that had fallen just hours before. He didn't glance in her direction, not once. Rachel sat up slowly, the soft morning light casting long shadows across the room. The warmth of his body still lingered in the sheets, but now it felt like a memory she couldn't hold on to. Just last night, they were tangled in each other's arms, whispering breaths, skin to skin, closer than they had ever been. Now he moved like it had never happened. Shocked, confused, she wrapped the duvet around her chest and followed him, bare feet soundless against the floor. He entered his room across the hall, the door already halfway closed when her voice stopped him. "So that's it?" she said, breath catching. "You're not going to say anything to me?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe, then looked at her for the briefest moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low, strained. "Whatever happened last night, it wasn't supposed to. Let's just go back to the way things were." Her eyes widened, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "Strangers?" she whispered, stunned. "I'm your wife. What we shared last night was real. I don't regret any of it." He exhaled, long and slow, eyes flickering away. "That's the problem," he said quietly, almost too calm. This isn't meant for me." Then, without waiting for another word, he closed the door gently, shutting her out. Rachel stood frozen in the hallway, her grip tightening on the duvet as though it could hold her together. She retreated slowly to her room, the silence in the house now deafening. She wanted to cry, scream, beg the night to rewind, but no tears came, only the ache. She sat back on the edge of her bed, hands trembling, the memory of his touch still etched into her skin. The way he kissed her, the way he held her, it had felt like the beginning of something real. But now, with nothing but silence between them, she wasn't sure it would ever happen again. Rachel kept her distance in the days that followed, not out of anger, but out of quiet shame. She couldn't explain why, but something in her felt exposed, like she had handed over a piece of herself too freely, too vulnerably. She poured herself into distractions, filling her time with paperwork, meetings, reading, anything to silence the memory of his touch. But no matter how much she tried to focus, her thoughts betrayed her. The more she avoided Bramston, the more she found herself yearning for the man she had seen, just for that one night. The man who had held her gently, kissed her like she was the only thing in his world. And the rain didn't help. It returned like an unwelcome companion, soft against the windows, echoing every memory she had tried to bury. That afternoon, as she stood near the grand staircase, Peter informed her quietly, "Mr. Bramston won't be returning until late." She simply nodded, thanked him, and turned away, heart sinking. He had been coming home late each day, slipping in long after the house had gone still. Maybe he was avoiding her too. That thought settled uneasily in her chest as she returned to her room, changed into something comfortable, and climbed into bed. She lay there, trying to force herself to sleep, but her body resisted. Her mind kept drifting back, to his hands on her waist, to the weight of his gaze, to the sound of her name on his lips. Then, in the silence, she heard it, the soft creak of the main entrance opening. Bramston entered like a man trying not to disturb a sleeping house, his jacket damp from the rain, steps muffled. But sleep wouldn't come for him either, not after what they had shared. He lay in bed, eyes wide open, turning from side to side as everything came back in fragments, the scent of her perfume, the warmth of her skin, the way she had moaned his name like it was something sacred. Her voice lingered in his memory, a sound more intimate than any word she'd ever spoken to him. He could still feel her hair beneath his fingertips, smell her shampoo clinging to his hands long after she was gone. And what unsettled him most wasn't the night itself. It was how she had looked at him, like he was worth something, like she saw a man he couldn't find in himself. That terrified him more than anything. Bramston and Rachel fell back into the rhythm of their lives, the quiet routines that had once been their comfort now feeling like a performance. They moved through the house as if rehearsed actors, each step and glance measured and calculated. They passed each other in the halls with nothing more than a polite nod, shared meals only when their schedules collided, and retreated to their separate corners of the mansion at night, as though they were strangers. But something had shifted, something unspoken. Every time their eyes met, there was an electric tension between them, an awareness that lingered in the air. It was as if they both felt it, the weight of what had happened, of the night that they could no longer erase from their memories. And yet, pretending was easier than facing it. At least, that's what they both told themselves, until it became too much to bear. The cracks began small, almost imperceptible at first. Bramston, who had never been much for breakfast, found himself lingering in the kitchen in the mornings, sitting at the marble island with a cup of black coffee that he barely touched. His eyes would follow Rachel as she moved about, the sound of the kettle boiling filling the otherwise quiet space. He noticed how the soft fabric of her robe fell over her shoulders, how her fingers curled around the porcelain of her teacup, how she blew gently on the steaming liquid before taking a sip. There was something almost intimate in the way she moved, and he couldn't help but watch, though he never let on. Rachel, for her part, felt the shift too. She could feel his presence behind her, even before she turned. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't look at him directly, but her heart would race each time he was near. She tried to convince herself it was irritation or frustration, anything but the truth, that something inside her was being pulled in a direction she wasn't sure she wanted to go. One morning, as she reached for the honey, their hands brushed, and neither of them moved for a moment. The touch was so brief, so subtle, but it lingered between them like a question neither of them was ready to answer. Still, they said nothing. The silence between them grew heavy, but neither was willing to break it, not yet. And so they continued their dance, the steps more complicated than before, the tension more palpable, as they both tried to pretend it was nothing. But neither of them could escape the truth for long. The gala was in full swing, the ballroom buzzing with the sound of polished conversation and soft laughter. Rachel stood at the center of it all, a vision in a floor-length gown that seemed to capture the light and hold it in shimmering waves. Every eye was on her as she moved effortlessly from one conversation to another, engaging with donors, partners, and influencers with a grace that made her seem untouchable. She was stunning, poised, radiant, a woman who commanded attention without ever seeming to seek it. Meanwhile, Bramston stood at the periphery, his eyes never straying too far from her. He played the part of the perfect host, delivering his speech with his usual charm and confidence, but there was something in the way he held himself tonight, something tighter, more controlled. As the guests cheered, applauding his eloquence, he stood off to the side, sipping his drink, his gaze fixed on her. She was the woman he wanted, yet the woman who terrified him. The more he watched her connect with others, the more he felt a gnawing sense of unease, something he couldn't shake. Then, Davison, a well-known businessman, sharp in both style and manner, approached her. He was high stakes, confident, and suddenly the air felt heavier. They spoke for a while, exchanging words in a way that was far too intimate for Bramston's liking. Rachel smiled, laughed, and leaned in slightly, her attention fully on him. Davison handed her a glass of wine, his fingers brushing against hers just a beat too long. The gesture seemed innocent, but to Bramston, it sent a cold shiver down his spine. A whisper here, a touch there, it all felt too close, too personal. He didn't know when it happened, but the jealousy surged through him, hot and furious. Without thinking, he squeezed the wine glass in his hand so tightly that it shattered, sending glass fragments tumbling across the floor. The room went silent, all eyes turning to him. The blood trickled down his palm, but he barely noticed. His gaze locked onto Rachel, who had stopped midair, her hand still lifted in a wave to Davison. She looked at him, confused, as he walked away, brushing past guests without sparing a second glance. He didn't care what anyone thought. He only cared that she was his, and no one else could touch her. They sat in the back of the car, the quiet stretching between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Rachel's eyes were fixed on him, her mind racing with questions that she couldn't voice. Her hands were still trembling slightly, the faint scent of wine lingering in the air. "Are you okay?" she finally asked, her voice soft but steady. Bramston turned his face away, the weight of his emotions too much for him to bear. He didn't speak, his jaw clenched tight as he stared out the window, the cool night air rushing past. He couldn't explain the storm that had stirred inside him, how seeing her with someone else had made something inside him snap. But there was no explaining it. Not yet. Instead, he turned his attention to the blood staining his hand, the broken glass, and the quiet tension between them. As the car pulled up to the estate, Bramston was already out, his feet hitting the marble floors of the grand entrance before Rachel had even stepped out. His movements were swift, almost urgent, as though he couldn't bear another moment of tension. He entered the house quickly, his mind racing, and sat down, trying to tend to the blood still dripping from his hand. Mr. Peter, the house staff, helped clean the injury, his hands gentle as he applied pressure to stop the bleeding. But Bramston's mind was elsewhere, lost in the whirlwind of emotions he was too afraid to face. Once Peter finished, Bramston made to retreat to his room, his mind focused on the solitude that awaited him. But then he froze. There she was, Rachel, standing at the top of the stairs in a silk nightdress that clung to her skin like it was designed to haunt him. The soft light from the chandelier caught her silhouette, making her seem almost otherworldly. "Why the scene?" she asked politely, her voice cool, but there was something behind her eyes, something that was still unresolved. His jaw clenched, frustration building in his chest. "Scene?" he echoed, his voice tight. He should have said something harsh, something to make her feel as unsettled as he did, but all that came out was a forced, strangled sound. She stood still, watching him, her gaze unwavering. "You don't care, do you?" he said, a slight edge to his voice. "Talking to those men, throwing yourself at them." His words were laced with frustration, but they were also raw, like he was trying to throw her actions in her face, trying to make her see what she had done. Rachel turned to face him fully, her expression neutral, but her eyes sparkled with something defiant. "Do you care that much?" she asked, a touch of sarcasm in her voice. "Is it jealousy?" Bramston stuttered, his eyes narrowing as he looked away, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't supposed to care. He wasn't supposed to feel this way, but the idea of other men touching her, laughing with her, made something inside him twist painfully. I don't know," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. She watched him waiting, but then, as if she had already made up her mind, she started to leave for her room. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her back toward him. He pinned her against the wall, his body flush against hers as he breathed her in. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice desperate. "After what happened between us, I can't just act like it didn't mean something." He could barely keep his voice steady, feeling exposed, raw in a way he had never allowed himself to be. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his hand trembling as he held her wrist. "I want more, but I'm afraid. I don't know how to handle it, Rachel." She held his gaze, her heart racing. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Before she could say more, he kissed her, his lips desperate, searching for the connection they had once shared. His hands roamed over her, not to claim her but to remind himself she was real. She held his hands, squeezing gently, feeling the tension in his body, the vulnerability he was trying so hard to suppress. He let out a quiet sound of pain. Ouch! As she gripped his hand too tightly, but neither of them pulled away. With a forceful tenderness, he lifted her and carried her to his room. This time it was slow and deliberate, his movements almost painful in their intensity. When they reached the bed, he whispered words of reassurance, of longing, and in that moment they both realized it wasn't just physical. It was a choice they were making together, a choice to finally face what they had been avoiding. The billionaire who had always guarded himself had torn down the walls he had built around his heart. Rachel, for the first time in what felt like forever, felt a connection that went beyond the touch of his hands. It was everything they had been afraid to admit, now finally spoken in the silence between them. "Even though I asked you to pretend like it was nothing," he whispered, his voice thick with the weight of his confession. "It meant everything to me." And for the first time, he knew that everything he had been taught, everything he had grown up hearing about love and marriage, everything that had shaped his understanding of relationships, it haunted him, it broke him, and it left him vulnerable. But here, in this moment, with her, he realized it wasn't just fear that kept him from love. It was the fear of losing himself in it. The change was subtle at first, almost imperceptible in its quiet unfolding. Bramston found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the grand gestures he had known all his life, the ones that demanded attention and recognition. No, this was something quieter, something more intimate. He started to notice things. The way she adjusted her hair before meetings, as if trying to tame something unruly within herself. The delicate swipe of lipstick as she prepared to face the world. He never said it aloud, but sometimes, when she entered the room dressed for the day, he'd find
"That
himself
color suits you,"
staring just a
he'd
second
say
longer
casually,
than necessary,
his voice steady.
But there was something in the tone, something deeper, that suggested a growing appreciation, not just for her appearance, but for the woman she was. Rachel, who had long been accustomed to his cool indifference, caught the warmth in his words. She didn't acknowledge it at first, not wanting to make it something it wasn't, but she couldn't help the flicker of something inside her when he complimented her. It wasn't about the clothing, it was about him seeing her. And then, there were the gifts. They weren't extravagant, not the kind of gifts one might expect from a man of his status, but rather thoughtful tokens that seemed to reflect how deeply he was beginning to observe her. A rare edition of a book she had mentioned in passing, a scarf that matched the color of her eyes, a small handcrafted trinket from a market he had visited during one of his trips. Each one was a quiet acknowledgement, an offering that didn't ask for anything in return, but simply existed as a reminder of his attention. He began spending more time near her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. She was always lost in her books, turning pages in the soft glow of the evening light. At first, he would sit quietly in the corner, his thoughts wandering, but over time, he found himself inching closer, lingering in the space she occupied. He wasn't asking to join her, he was simply there, absorbing the calm that came from her presence, finding himself compelled to see the world through her eyes. She never asked him to share her space, but when she noticed him watching her with quiet interest, she realized that something had shifted. The small details began to matter, how she hummed softly under her breath when she worked, the way she fidgeted with the edges of her papers when she was deep in thought, how she would absent-mindedly tap her foot when she was waiting for something. Bramston started to see her patterns, to understand her rhythms. He watched as she carefully curated her reading list, as she paused to take in the world around her with such attention to detail. He admired how she moved through the world with a quiet grace, always so aware, so present in everything she did. One evening, she caught him reading a book from her collection, a novel she had recommended but never expected him to pick up. "You like crime novels?" she asked, surprised. He shrugged, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I like to see the world through different lenses." There was no grand confession, no words of love spoken aloud. But in the way he leaned in just a little closer, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, it was clear. Neither of them named it, this connection, this slow, careful dance, but it was already there. And it was growing, quietly and without fanfare, a bond neither of them had anticipated, but both of them felt with every glance, every small gesture. It happened that morning. The rain was pouring down and Rachel wasn't expecting it. Her cycle arrived with a sudden, painful twist. The cramps were more intense than usual, stabbing and relentless, making it hard for her to focus on anything else. She hadn't planned for it to be this severe, but there she was, curled up on the couch at home, clutching her stomach. She would have managed it herself, as she always did, but this time, the pain was overwhelming. Bramston had already kissed her goodbye, heading off for work. They had talked about the day the night before, making small plans, but she never expected her body to betray her like this. She figured she could push through, like she always did, but today was different. It wasn't until later in the day when Bramston came to check on her, bringing lunch to her office, that he noticed she was missing. The secretary informed him that Rachel had gone home, not feeling well. Concern immediately surged through him, and he rushed out, making a beeline for the house. He stopped at the mall on the way, picking up snacks, drinks, and even a cramp relief kit, his mind racing with what he could do to make her feel better. When he arrived, he hurried inside and found her curled up in her room, her hands pressing into her abdomen, her face pale and tired. His heart tightened seeing her like that. "I didn't know it was this bad," he said, his voice filled with regret. She gave him a faint, understanding smile, but didn't say much. "Don't worry about it," she whispered, trying to make light of it, though her voice betrayed the pain. But he couldn't leave her like this. He gently scooped her into his arms and carried her to his room. "You're staying here now," he said, his voice firm, as though ensuring she knew he wasn't going to let her suffer alone. "My eyes are on you." The hard, controlled billionaire was nowhere to be found. Instead, a softer side emerged, one that cared in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before. He set her down carefully on the bed and reached for the cramp relief machine, setting it gently around her belly, making sure everything was just right. His touch was gentle, tender, and he couldn't help but brush a strand of hair from her face as he made sure she was comfortable. He didn't want to leave her side, not when she needed him most. She drifted off to sleep, and he stayed by her side, quietly watching over her, not willing to leave her alone. Later that evening, she woke to find a tray of food on the side table still warm. She smiled softly as she saw it, but as soon as she tasted the soup, she grimaced. It was far too salty, and she sighed in defeat, trying to mask the taste. She muttered to herself, the flavor overwhelming, and she ended up pouring the soup into the salver paper. She couldn't help but smile at his effort. Reaching for her phone, she texted him, "Thanks for the food, Bramston." It was the thought that counts. She felt the warmth of his care in those small gestures, and despite the soup not being perfect, the effort behind it meant more to her than words could express. Bramston made the food specially for her, though it wasn't something he had ever done before. Mr. Peter had offered to help, but Bramston insisted on doing it himself. The kitchen, usually a place he never ventured into, was now his domain as he clumsily navigated it, watching YouTube videos to make sure he didn't mess it up. He wasn't accustomed to being so hands-on, but today he was determined to make it right. The sight of him, out of his element, pouring his attention into something as simple as making soup, was a stark contrast to the controlled, precise man everyone else knew. He had never needed to cook before, but for her, he was willing to learn. to stumble his way through the unfamiliar, just to make sure she felt cared for. Bramston and Rachel decided to take 2 weeks to themselves, a rare opportunity to step away from the chaos of their usual lives and simply focus on each other. With Mr. Peter on a break, it was just the two of them, free to explore each other's worlds without any distractions. It wasn't a grand plan, just an unspoken agreement to let things unfold at their own pace. They did things they had never had time for: walks in the garden, spontaneous trips, quiet evenings where they simply existed in each other's presence. The atmosphere between them had shifted, no longer just a marriage of convenience, but a partnership that was slowly transforming into something deeper, something unexpected. Bramston, the man who had always kept his emotions carefully guarded, found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. Her laughter, the sound of her humming as she moved through the house, the way she listened to him, really listened. These small things, these unspoken connections, began to erode the walls he had built around himself. He hadn't expected it to happen like this. Love had always been a concept he feared, something he believed he didn't deserve, something that would only lead to pain. But Rachel, in her quiet way, had managed to turn that fear into something entirely different. She wasn't asking him to be someone else. She was simply there, allowing him to be who he was, with all his flaws, with all his vulnerabilities. One evening, after spending the day together, they found themselves in the shower, the sound of water cascading down around them like a soft, intimate rhythm. The warmth of the water mingled with the heat between them, and for the first time in a long while, Bramston allowed himself to be completely present. He couldn't hold back anymore. He reached for her, pulling her close, feeling the softness of her body against his, the connection so palpable that it felt like their souls were colliding. She smiled up at him, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw as their lips met in a kiss that was both slow and urgent, like they were both finally acknowledging what had been building between them. His hands moved gently over her, exploring with a tenderness that surprised even him. It wasn't about just the physical closeness. It was about everything they had been through, everything they had yet to face. She responded to him, matching his pace, her breath mingling with his as the kiss deepened, becoming more intense with each passing moment. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people finally allowing themselves to be vulnerable, to give and receive love without fear. The world outside of that small shower ceased to exist. There was only the rhythm of their bodies, the soft whispers of promises and assurances as they moved together. "I never thought I'd feel this way," he murmured between kisses, his voice rough with emotion. "You've changed everything, Rachel." She smiled, her eyes meeting his with the same intensity, the same depth of feeling. "You've changed too, Bramston," she whispered back. "You've let me in." Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was built on trust, on slowly peeling back the layers they had both kept hidden for so long. When the moments of passion subsided, they held each other, both breathing heavily, the silence between them speaking volumes. They had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love, and for the first time in his life, Bramston knew that love wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace, something that made him feel whole. 2 weeks later, Rachel walked into his office, the soft rustling of the door breaking the silence as she approached his desk. Her face was a mix of excitement and uncertainty, and when she placed the small envelope in front of him, his heart skipped a beat. He opened it slowly, his mind racing with all sorts of thoughts, and then he saw the result. Pregnant. At first, the shock hit him like a freight train. His world seemed to slow down as he processed the news. Rachel, standing there in front of him, watching him carefully, waiting for his reaction, saw the mix of fear and hope in his eyes. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind flashing to his own father, his harsh words, his disappointment. the feeling of never being good enough. He had always feared that he would be a failure as a father, that he would repeat the mistakes of his past, that he wouldn't know how to protect or love a child the way they deserved. But as he looked at Rachel, he saw something different. He saw a future not just for them, but for their family. He wasn't ready, but he wanted to be. He wanted to do this with her, despite the fear that gripped him. "I don't know if I can be the father you expect me to be," he said, his voice trembling with vulnerability. "I've never seen what a good father looks like. My own father. He never believed in me." Rachel moved toward him, her hand resting gently on his. "You don't have to be perfect," she said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. "I believe in you, Bramston. I believe in us." Tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He had always prided himself on being strong, unshakable, but in this moment, he let himself feel. He felt the weight of what was coming: fatherhood, responsibility, love, but more than anything, he felt the overwhelming need to give his child the kind of love and support he never had. He pulled Rachel close, holding her tightly, like he was afraid to let go. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," she replied, her fingers stroking his back. "But we'll do this together, Bramston. We're a team." And for the first time in his life, Bramston believed it. He believed that he could be the man, the father, he had always feared he couldn't be. With Rachel by his side, he would try, he would fight, and he would love, wholeheartedly. And in that moment, under the weight of their shared promises and fears, he kissed her, slow and deep, a meeting of souls more than bodies. As they both knew, this was only the beginning of their new chapter. They had started as strangers, bound by an arrangement born of necessity, but now they were everything a real marriage should be. Rooted in respect, watered by time, and bloomed into love. Their journey together was far from over, and it was only the beginning. We have come to the end of the story, and I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.